I remember how the silence in the kitchen felt that morning. It pressed against my chest in a slow, suffocating way, like the start of a claustrophobic dream where you realize you can't breathe, but can't seem to wake up either. My gaze lingered on the half-empty coffee cup he had left behind, still steaming slightly, and I caught a fleeting glimpse of my own reflection in the mirrored surface of the liquid. I looked haunted, older than I felt inside, a woman living on the edges of someone else's needs. I took a deep breath, trying to steel myself against the predictable wave of disappointment that was already settling across my shoulders. It was our anniversary, yet again, and he had forgotten. It wasn't just that he hadn't planned some big event or presented me with flowers or even a card. It was the pure, unspoken fact that he hadn't even remembered what day it was. Last year, I tried to make excuses for him, telling myself that maybe his job had been hectic, or perhaps he'd just lost track of the date. But year after year, that perpetual oversight was starting to feel less like forgetfulness and more like deliberate neglect. My heart ached with the weight of every single year that this day went unnoticed, and beneath that ache, a different feeling began to stir. It wasn't quite anger. It was something more resigned, more simmering, the quiet kind of resentment that spreads through your veins when you realize that you've been too patient for too long. As I stood by the kitchen counter, staring at that abandoned coffee, I remembered how, once upon a time, this particular day held the promise of everything good. We used to sit at the table together, our knees brushing, our future unwritten and exciting. There was a time he would make sure to at least acknowledge me, an affectionate kiss or an intimate whisper of "I love you," something that said, "I see you, I care." But the last half-decade had turned that memory to dust. He'd grown so comfortable in my constant presence, so assured of my loyalty, that he didn't even look back at me when he rushed out of the house that morning, saying nothing more than, "Don't forget to check on the listing for the car, honey." That was the last thing he said to me. Not "good morning, darling," or "happy anniversary," but a reminder that the listing for his vintage convertible, something he was supposedly only half-joking about selling, needed supervision. And so I was left with a vacant house, a pile of chores, and a pang of sadness that I could barely allow myself to fully feel because it was too raw and too familiar. I wondered what he'd be doing at this moment, probably marching into his office, greeting his colleagues, sipping coffee in the break room, oblivious to the significance of the date. The memory of how we used to be felt like a cruel distortion of my reality. The kids, both grown, rarely called anymore. Perhaps they sensed the tension between us, or maybe they were just living their own lives. I recalled how once, on a day like this, I'd told our daughter about feeling lonely, and she said, "Mom, you've always been so strong, so self-sufficient. Why are you letting something small get you down?" It struck me then that I'd done such a good job seeming invincible that nobody realized just how deep the wounds could go. I wiped away the tears that were threatening to spill. A part of me felt silly for being this emotional. Another part was furious that he had the nerve to text me around noon to ask if we still had leftover pizza, never once mentioning our anniversary. Something inside me clenched with tension, a little coil of energy that felt both painful and necessary. I was tired of being relegated to the background, the quiet caretaker, the consistent presence that he never thought to appreciate. And that's when the memory of the auction listing for his beloved classic car came racing to the forefront of my mind. I had put that listing up initially as a bit of a playful jab. He always bragged about his beauty, as he called that old convertible, and I teased him that if he wasn't going to take me out in it anymore, maybe I should sell it to someone who would get real use out of it. He laughed and said, "Go ahead, you wouldn't dare." And so I set up an auction listing online. But the more I typed in the details, its model, year, mileage, the more I wondered, would he even notice if it disappeared? The question was rhetorical, mostly. Of course he'd notice. That car was probably more precious to him than anything. But I needed to see how far his obliviousness went. I assumed he'd eventually say, "Honey, you took that listing down, right?" Or at the very least double-check the status. But it had been days, weeks now, and he hadn't asked again. He never checked in. He never made sure it was canceled. And I had, on some level, forgotten all about it. Not literally forgotten, but in the swirl of everyday chores, small betrayals, cold silences, repressed arguments, that silly listing seemed like a trivial piece of our ongoing drama. So when he told me not to forget to check on it that morning, it was like a rude jolt back to reality. Right after that, he waltzed out the door, not even a glance in my direction. And I found myself thinking, fine. Let it happen. Let that car actually go to someone who'll pay attention to it, because apparently, paying attention to important things like me, like our marriage, wasn't in his repertoire anymore. I quietly told myself I'd check the listing eventually, that I'd do the responsible thing and cancel the sale, because deep down I knew he loved that car more than he'd ever admit. But that vow to eventually became a fleeting afterthought as the day wore on. My phone buzzed with the reminder of an overdue library book, the neighbor's cat yowled outside, and the slow, steady anger I felt overshadowed everything else. The hours crept by, and I found myself immersed in old memories, drifting through our albums stacked haphazardly in the garage. There was one photo that caught my eye, a snapshot of us from years ago, the day he brought that convertible home. I was wearing a sundress, hair pinned back, leaning against the pristine hood, smiling like I had everything I could ever want. He was standing next to me, beaming with boyish excitement, one arm around my shoulder. And I remembered how warm his hand felt there, how secure it once made me feel. Now, the chill in the present made that memory sting. My reflection in the window of the garage door told me what I already knew. The glow in my cheeks from that photograph was gone. Maybe it was hidden underneath the layers of routine resentment, or maybe it was just extinguished by his apathy. Slowly, the recollections of countless anniversaries came flooding back. The first year he forgot. We were dealing with a sick child, so I forgave him. The second year, he was traveling, so I gave him the benefit of the doubt. The third, we had just moved, and I told myself that stress probably clouded his mind. The fourth, well, that was last year, and I remember writing a letter to him, but I never gave it, because I convinced myself it was pointless. Now, here we were, the fifth year in a row, and I felt like a fool. I closed that album with a shaky sigh and returned to the kitchen. The day was moving in slow motion, like a somber waltz that kept me pinned in place. My stomach churned with anticipation for something that would never come, an apology, a simple statement of acknowledgement, a gesture of love. When he finally came home that evening, the house seemed to hold its breath. I observed him shrug out of his jacket and toss it over a chair, rummage in the fridge for something to snack on, and then glance my way with the bored detachment of someone greeting a houseplant. No mention of the date. No hint of concern for my mood. He had that self-important aura about him, the one that said, I am the center of this house, and everything else is just peripheral. I don't know if he was always like that, or if it grew worse over the years, but it was sure as daylight to me now. I put on a resigned smile, not saying a word. What was there to say? His phone chirped with a notification, and I watched him lean over to check. Something about that moment felt like an omen. A part of me braced for the possibility that it was a friend or a potential buyer asking about the car, but he gave no sign of alarm. He just mumbled a half-formed sentence about a meeting tomorrow and then asked me if the coffee was still warm. That night, I didn't sleep well. The tension in my chest felt heavier than usual. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, recalling how many nights I'd spent in this very bed, quietly longing for some sense of togetherness. I heard him lightly snoring beside me and realized how estranged I felt, how alone one could be even when someone else's body occupied the same bed. Around 2 in the morning, I slipped out, crept down the stairs, and flicked on the kitchen light. My phone was sitting on the table, and the screen glowed with the listing page I'd last opened hours ago. For a moment, I just stood there, heart pounding, a swirl of conflicting emotions swirling in my belly. A single click would cancel it. Another single click would confirm the final sale. I hesitated. My finger hovered over the screen. Part of me wanted to save us both the mess, to simply turn off the listing so that the car would remain in our garage, unscathed by the drama that had become my life. But another part was whispering, he doesn't deserve to keep what he loves if he can't even see you. That whisper was raw, battered, but heartbreakingly firm. I slipped the phone into my robe pocket without doing anything. Instead, I just stared out the window into the darkness of the backyard. The night insects were buzzing, the wind rustled the branches of the old oak tree, and somewhere, I heard the soft bark of a neighbor's dog. It was an orchestra of everyday life, yet I felt on the brink of something cataclysmic. I tried to gather myself, breathing in and out until my heartbeat slowed. There was no sense in making a rash decision at 2 in the morning, I told myself. Yet, in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the image of that listing closing out, the highest bidder claiming his prized possession. I also couldn't shake the memory of how this entire marriage had slowly eroded the playful, passionate me I used to know. It was like the me of yesteryear had been lost in the shuffle of forgetfulness and disregard. By the time dawn broke, I was back in bed, though I hadn't slept a wink. He got up with his usual fuss, muttering about how tired he was, how he needed to be at the office early for some important conference call. I listened silently, arms folded over my chest, my eyes following him as he got dressed. He caught my gaze in the mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of concern in his expression. Maybe he noticed the circles under my eyes or the stress etched into my face. But all he said was, "Could you make sure we have dinner sorted tonight? I might have to stay late." Then he left without a goodbye kiss or a single question about how I was feeling. It was so normal, so routine, that I could have predicted it in my sleep. And still, it managed to slice a fresh wound through my heart. After the door slammed shut, I sank onto the edge of our bed, arms wrapped around my torso as if to hold myself together. It was only then I remembered that the listing for his car was very much still active. And from what I vaguely recalled seeing, there was already a decent number of bids lined up. It wasn't some idle curiosity from potential buyers. People were genuinely interested, offering sums that would make it a real sale. A pang of guilt reverberated through me. I had let it go this far. Did I truly want to be the cause of taking something he loved away from him? But then, a more defiant voice chimed in. Why should you feel guilty for something he gave you the green light to do in the first place? He never once asked you to stop. He forgot your anniversary. He forgot you. The day wore on in that emotional haze, with me drifting between chores and contemplations. I went grocery shopping, paused at a florist display filled with bright bouquets, and thought of how I used to get flowers from him once in a blue moon. I felt a bitter taste in my mouth, turned away from the flowers, and continued on. In the produce aisle, I accidentally knocked over a display of apples. An older woman helped me gather them, and when I apologized, she laid a hand on my shoulder and said, "It happens. Don't be too hard on yourself, dear." I nearly broke down in tears right there because it had been so long since I'd felt that small gesture of kindness. Later, at home, I found the empty house eerily comforting. I wandered from room to room, letting the hush fill my ears. My thoughts kept drifting to the car. We'd hardly driven in it together anymore, but I used to love sitting in the passenger seat, letting the wind whip through my hair, feeling a closeness with him that was intangible but real. Those drives felt like freedom, a moment of connection away from life's burdens. Where did all of that go? After some time spent aimlessly flipping through channels on the television, I found my phone again. I couldn't stop looking at the blinking icon that told me there were messages on the auction site. Interested buyers, likely wanting more information. I swallowed, feeling a tremor of something akin to fear. If I responded, it meant I was moving forward with the sale. If I ignored it, perhaps the bids would stagnate and the listing would expire. A big part of me wanted to let that happen, to spare myself the guilt and him the heartbreak. But my resentment flared, and before I fully realized what I was doing, I was typing a response. Short, factual, but it confirmed that yes, the car was still available, and yes, it was in excellent condition. By the time I hit send, my hands were shaking. A wave of adrenaline and shame flooded me. I wondered, was this who I'd become? So vengeful, so starved for acknowledgement, that I would let a bunch of strangers bid on his prized possession, all because he forgot our anniversary one too many times? But then I reminded myself that it wasn't just about the anniversary. It was about feeling invisible for years, about quietly swallowing every disappointment, about living for someone who never considered the damage he inflicted. The day turned into evening. He texted me, as expected, that he'd be home late and could I please keep dinner warm. I stared at the message, my jaw tightening. No mention of how I was, no mention of the date, because to him, it was just another day. My mind drifted again to the car. Maybe I wouldn't mention that either. Let him figure it out himself. Or would he remain so oblivious that even that would slip his notice? My phone pinged with another update, a new highest bid. A sharp pang sliced through me. The bids were growing. Someone really wanted it. I could practically smell the tang of revenge in the air, mixing with the guilt that threatened to swamp me. I closed my eyes and let out a shaky breath. It was almost midnight when he came home. I had set out a plate of reheated food on the counter. He ate in silence, scrolling through his phone. I observed him from the living room, where I pretended to be reading a book. He looked tired, but not remorseful, not guilty, not even curious why I was so quiet. The only words he tossed my way were, "Thanks for dinner, honey," and "I'm exhausted," before he climbed the stairs and disappeared into the bedroom. I followed after a while and found him already asleep. I stood there, looking at his still form, feeling this swirling mix of sorrow and indignation, love that was battered but not fully dead, and a sinking realization that I might never get him back the way he used to be. A single tear slipped down my cheek, and I let myself cry quietly, stifling the sobs with the back of my hand. The next few days were a repetitive cycle of that same stifled tension. I found it increasingly difficult to pretend everything was fine. I got calls from prospective buyers. I answered them in hushed tones, often stepping outside onto the back porch where the brisk autumn air chilled me. The more inquiries I fielded, the more real it became. People wanted specifics: the VIN, the maintenance records, the reason for selling. I gave them the answers. My husband, caught up in his own world, never once asked how it was going. Meanwhile, I found myself remembering small, tender moments from our early years, the time he sang to me off-key on a road trip, the time he held my hand in the hospital when I had complications after our daughter was born, the way he used to rest his chin on my shoulder when I was reading. Each memory came wrapped in a soft glow, and each reminded me of how distant we were now. It hurt, yet also fueled my determination. There was a twisted comfort in knowing that I could still feel something. One afternoon, I was out front, watering the potted plants on the porch, when our neighbor, Mrs. Dawson, strolled over with her mild, gentle smile. She asked how things were going, and in her subtle, prying way, she hinted that she'd noticed tension between my husband and me. I waved it off. She patted my arm lightly, as though to say, "I see you." Then she changed the subject, gushing about some new renovation project her daughter was doing. Before she left, she said, "Sometimes a wake-up call is needed, dear." I don't know if she knew about the anniversary or if she sensed my internal storm, but her words stayed with me. That evening, I scrolled through the auction bids again, now climbing to a sum that would definitely seal the deal. In less than a week, the listing would close. I felt like a ticking time bomb, anticipating the moment when the final bid would come in and everything would become irrevocable. The realization struck me, he still had no clue. Part of me wondered if he'd ever realized that final day was approaching, or if he believed I'd already canceled it because that's just what I'd always done, resolve any potential trouble for him, make sure his world ran smoothly. The 5th year of him forgetting our anniversary had pushed me beyond the edge of my usual tolerance, and I was drifting in unknown territory now. My conscience gnawed at me, especially in the late hours when I tried to fall asleep. But the memory of his dismissiveness, his lack of even a simple, "How are you feeling?" fortified my resolve. By the time the final 48 hours of the auction approached, my nerves were a tangled mess. Meanwhile, life around me carried on in its mundane routine. I still had groceries to buy, errands to run, a house to maintain. He continued his shuffle of office visits and ignoring the fact that we were on the brink of losing the one possession he cherished most. Each time the thought flashed through my mind, I felt a wave of both vindication and sadness. The last night before the auction ended, he mentioned he'd be gone early the next morning for a work event. I bit my lip, struggling not to spit out the truth about what was happening. For some reason, I wanted him to ask me, to show even the smallest sign that he was paying attention. Maybe if he did, I'd call the whole thing off. But he didn't. I was invisible again. That next morning, I watched him leave the house in a rush. My heart pounded against my ribcage so hard I could feel it in my throat. The auction would end around noon. He'd be tied up at work, ironically oblivious to the moment that might change his life. After he left, I paced around the living room, unable to focus on anything else. The minutes ticked by on the clock above the mantel. I drummed my fingers on the edge of the couch, then walked to the kitchen, then walked back again. Around 11, I opened my laptop to check the bidding status. The highest bid was staggering. I stared at the screen, suddenly breathless. Could I really go through with this? Was I truly about to let this happen and watch his prized possession slip from under him? I wrestled with the question, replaying every insensitive moment, every neglected anniversary, every belittling glance. Then I remembered the woman I once was, how lively and hopeful. I asked myself if I wanted to spend the rest of my life locked in the cycle of disregard. Noon approached like a gathering storm. My finger hovered over the listing, contemplating the possibility of canceling it at the last minute. I was trembling, tears forming in my eyes. Then I thought of the thousands of tears I'd cried in secret over the years, the times I tried to get him to see me, to value me, to remember me. And in that moment, something inside me hardened. The last minute ticked down, and I did nothing. I watched as the page updated, sold. The red banner flashed across the top, confirming that final sale, locking me in a wave of guilt, horror, and a faint sense of triumph. I felt numb. I closed the laptop, my breath shallow, my mind spinning. He would find out eventually, and I braced myself for the moment he did. Hours passed in excruciating slowness. My phone buzzed with an email confirming the sale, instructions on how to arrange the handover. I clenched my teeth as I read it, mentally preparing for the confrontation. Late afternoon, his call came. I answered, my voice shaky. He was frantic. He'd just checked his email and saw messages from the auction site. I heard the panic in his voice. "You sold the car?" he practically shouted. My heart pounded. I wanted to say, "You told me to do it, remember?" But the words stuck in my throat. After a long pause, I finally said, "You never asked me to cancel it." The silence on the other end was deafening. Then he erupted into fury, spewing accusations. How could I do such a thing? That car meant everything to him. Didn't I know how important it was? His voice crackled with blame, as though I'd committed an unforgivable sin. Through the tears that prickled my eyes, I managed to respond. It was listed for weeks. You never noticed. You forgot we even needed to talk about it. He started to say something else, but I whispered, "You forgot about our anniversary, too." For the 5th year in a row. That stopped him. I heard him breathing heavily, words escaping him. He tried to stammer out an excuse, something about being overwhelmed at work, how the date just slipped his mind. I felt a burning frustration. Everything slips your mind, doesn't it? Everything except your own wants. There was a tone of shock in his voice, as though he was realizing for the first time that I might not be the docile, forgettable wife he thought he had. He said we'd talk when he got home, and then he hung up. I sat there, phone still in hand, tears sliding down my cheeks. Part of me felt monstrous for hurting him in such a direct way. But another part felt a flicker of power. He forgot our anniversary for the 5th time, so I forgot to cancel the auction. I turned the phone off, not wanting to field more of his furious calls or texts. In the silence of the living room, I could hear my own heartbeat, the whoosh of blood in my ears. It was strangely calming to realize that I had taken an action that disrupted the status quo. I wasn't just passively letting him erode me anymore. I sat there for what felt like hours, waiting for his return. When he finally burst through the front door, his expression was a whirlwind of anger, shock, and maybe even fear. He demanded an explanation, voice rising. I stood there, trembling but resolved, and said, "It's not my job to keep track of what you care about anymore." He advanced on me, eyes wide with disbelief, hands shaking. "That's my car, the one real thing in my life I've worked for." I cut him off, my tone sharp. Then maybe you should have remembered it, the same way you should have remembered me. He paused, momentarily speechless. The power dynamic shifted, an inversion of all those years I tiptoed around, trying not to upset him. I wasn't tiptoeing anymore. I spelled it out, my voice raw. You have been neglecting this marriage, neglecting me. You couldn't even remember our anniversary. You live in your own bubble, and all I am is some background figure who cooks, cleans, makes your life neat. But I'm done enabling that. You forgot to check the listing. You forgot to ask about our relationship. This is the fallout. His face twisted with rage and confusion. How could you do that without telling me? He shouted. And I fired back. How could you forget me for 5 years in a row? That statement lingered in the air, a brutal truth laid bare. He sagged, shoulders dropping, an expression of shock crossing his face. He started to say something, but I couldn't handle any more for the moment. I turned away, went upstairs, locked the bedroom door. For a long time, I lay on the bed, shaking with sobs. This wasn't just about the car. This was about everything, every disappointment, every overlooked day, every unspoken tear. Eventually, I fell into a restless sleep, haunted by the implications of what I'd done. Over the next few days, the tension was unbearable. We navigated around each other like wounded animals. He tried to persuade me to contact the auction site, to find a loophole in the sale. He roared about how unfair it was, how I was punishing him too harshly. But beneath the anger, I sensed something else, panic. Maybe he realized this was bigger than the car, that it was about a love gone stale, about respect that had evaporated. We hardly spoke except to argue. The house felt like a war zone, with stray words as bullets. He blamed me, I blamed him, and neither of us wanted to budge. One day, I left the house in a hurry, desperate for some air. I drove around aimlessly, tears burning my eyes, wondering if I'd gone too far. Then I remembered that the final bidder was set to come pick up the car soon. The realization made my stomach churn. This was really happening. Maybe I should have told him earlier. Maybe I should have canceled it. But what would that change? Would he suddenly value me if I allowed him to keep his car? Would he magically remember our future anniversaries if he got his way once again? My mind echoed with a resounding no. The day the buyer came, my husband was in the driveway, arms folded, glaring defiantly at the tow truck that arrived to carry the car away. He looked so powerless, so outraged. I stood nearby, my arms wrapped around myself, heart pounding. The buyer seemed unaware of the personal drama unfolding. He was polite, excited to acquire such a gem. My husband insisted on speaking with him, trying to back out of the sale, but the buyer had all the legal paperwork. When my husband turned to me, eyes brimming with fury, I felt a wave of guilt, but also that same flicker of power. The car was loaded up, and as it was driven away, he looked at me like I was a stranger. I had to hold back tears, because in a way, maybe I'd become one. We retreated into the house, both stunned. He sat on the couch, ran his hands through his hair, muttering curses. I hovered near the stairs, arms crossed. Finally, in a broken voice, he said, "Why? Why would you hurt me like this?" I closed my eyes, tears escaping. "Because you hurt me every day in ways you don't even see," I said, voice trembling. "We were supposed to be partners, but I've been standing here alone for a long time." He said nothing. Hours later, we tried to talk, but the conversation devolved into blame. He insisted he never meant to hurt me, that I was overreacting, that our anniversary just wasn't something he was good at remembering. I retorted that it wasn't about a date, it was about respect and effort. He argued that he provided for us, gave me a good life, that I should appreciate everything he'd done. I fired back that a good life is more than material stability. It's feeling seen, heard, and loved. The next few days, he barely spoke to me, except in cold, clipped tones. Our son called during that time, and I found myself breaking down on the phone, trying not to unload too many details but failing. He sounded uncomfortable, unsure of what to say. He admitted he always saw tension but didn't realize it ran this deep. That conversation left me feeling more alone than ever. I had no idea if there was any way to repair what had been shattered, or even if I wanted to. The constant swirl of guilt, anger, heartbreak, and a tiny kernel of liberation battered me. One afternoon, I retreated to the garage, standing in the empty spot where the convertible once gleamed. It struck me as symbolic. The space that used to hold his greatest pride was now vacant, much like the space in our marriage. I recalled the day we got married, the promises we made. It occurred to me that promises without follow-through are just pretty words that fade with time. The day I received the payment from the buyer, I felt a wave of conflicting emotions. A sense of finality clung to every breath I took. He looked at me with an unspoken question. Would I hand it over to him? Would I use it as leverage, a trophy of vengeance? I placed the check on the kitchen table, told him it was his money. He stared at it, face expressionless. Then he mumbled a curt thanks and took it, retreating upstairs. I felt a lump in my throat. It wasn't about the money. It never was. It was about the years of intangible things he owed me: kindness, attention, affection, shared memories. No check could reimburse that. In the days following, a strange quiet settled over the house. We existed like two ghosts, crossing paths occasionally, never really intersecting. I half expected him to accuse me of sabotage or to demand I fix this. But that initial rage had cooled to a bitter acceptance. He carried on, going to work, coming home, barely engaging. I tried to delve into my routines, but it was hollow. Everything felt changed, as though the entire foundation of our relationship had been exposed as fragile. One evening, I found him sitting in the dark living room, a glass of whiskey in hand, staring at nothing. I hesitated in the doorway, unsure if I should say something. Finally, I asked quietly, "Are you okay?" He didn't move for a long moment. Then he said, "Do you still love me?" The rawness of that question cut through me. I opened my mouth to answer, but no words came out. Did I? Part of me would always love the memory of who he was, of what we once had. But the living, breathing reality of our relationship was a different story. After a silent eternity, I managed, "I don't know." He let out a shuddering breath, and in that moment, I saw a glimpse of vulnerability, of the man I once fell in love with. But it was fleeting. He placed the glass down and walked past me without another word. That sleepless night, I confronted the truth that maybe my act of letting that auction go through was a catalyst. It forced us both to see what had become of our marriage. He forgot our anniversary, yes, but that was just the tip of the iceberg. The real issue was that I felt discarded, unseen, a supporting character in my own life. And maybe I had become resentful enough to do something drastic. Over the next week, I found a small place to volunteer at a local community center. I needed to get out of the house, to interact with people who didn't look at me with a mixture of blame and regret. It was a welcome distraction. I felt some measure of purpose returning, a sense that I could still connect with the world outside of his shadow. When I got home from the center one afternoon, I found him seated at the kitchen table, a pile of papers in front of him. He looked like he'd aged 10 years. He motioned for me to sit down. I did, cautiously. He cleared his throat, looking deeply uncomfortable. I made an appointment," he began, voice tight. "Marriage counseling." My heart fluttered, uncertain. "You did?" "Yes," he said, gaze darting away. "I can't keep going like this. We can't keep going like this." I studied him for a moment, unsure if this was just an attempt to get me to reverse the damage or if he genuinely wanted to change. But I also realized that part of me had been waiting for him to do something like this for a long time, to show me he was willing to put in effort. "I'll go," I said softly. He exhaled, relief crossing his face, mixed with tension. "Thank you," he murmured, voice cracking slightly. And that was the beginning of a new, uncertain chapter. The first counseling session felt tense. We both were guarded, reluctant to open up fully. The therapist listened attentively as we explained how the car sale had triggered this crisis. When she asked about deeper issues, though, the conversation got more fraught. He tried to paint a picture of being overwhelmed at work, that he didn't intentionally forget me, that he just assumed everything was stable at home. I, in turn, unleashed years of pent-up frustration, describing how I felt invisible, how every day felt like a slow erasure of my worth. The therapist suggested we practice communicating our needs more directly, recommended some exercises to rebuild trust. We nodded along, but inside, I couldn't help wondering if it was too late. Still, I kept going to each session, hoping to see a sign that he'd genuinely change. The biggest shift came a few weeks later when we were both assigned to write about a memory that made us fall in love originally and then share it in the session. He wrote about the day we found out we were expecting our first child, how my face lit up despite all my fears, how he realized he wanted to protect me and that child with everything he had. I listened, tears quietly slipping down my cheeks as he recounted details I'd long believed he'd forgotten. Then it was my turn. I wrote about our wedding night, how he'd carried me over the threshold, how we'd giggled like silly teenagers, how we stayed up nearly all night talking about the life we dreamed of sharing. He was silent after I finished reading, eyes glassy. The therapist encouraged him to say something, and he whispered, "I'm sorry I lost sight of all that." He reached for my hand then, and I let him hold it. It felt like a fragile new piece, a tenuous step toward maybe understanding each other again. But real life was still waiting outside that counselor's office, with all its burdens and habits. In the weeks that followed, I noticed small changes. He tried to text me during the day, asking how I was, if I needed anything. He offered to help with dinner. He even apologized for years of forgetting anniversaries and special moments. But the resentment inside me didn't vanish overnight. It simmered, because we'd built up so much pain. Some nights, we found ourselves arguing, rehashing old wounds, slinging blame. He accused me of overreacting with the car. I accused him of pushing me to that brink. On more than one occasion, he slept in the guest room. Still, we kept going to counseling, and gradually, I sensed a shift in the dynamic. He recognized that I was no longer the woman who would stay silent. I recognized that if we were to move forward, I had to let go of some anger. A faint hope flickered in me that maybe we could salvage something if we both truly tried. About a month after the auction fiasco, I received a package at the front door. Inside was a small gift box. I opened it to find a photograph framed. It was the same picture we'd taken when he first brought that convertible home, me in my sundress, him with that boyish grin. Except now, scrawled beneath the image in black marker, was a handwritten note. "I remember us." My breath caught. I carefully traced the edge of the frame. That night, he came home, and I saw him glance at the picture where I'd propped it up on a side table. He met my gaze, something vulnerable passing between us. "Do you?" I asked softly, unsure if he understood the question behind my question. "I want to," he replied, voice trembling. "I'm trying to." We stood there, for a moment that felt like a quiet truce. He enveloped me in a hug, tentative and warm, and I let my head rest against his shoulder. I could feel his heartbeat, steady and real. In that moment, I realized I was crying, not from sorrow but from the bittersweetness of remembering how safe I once felt in his arms. The counseling sessions continued, and we made slow progress, unearthing the root of how we drifted. We talked about how after the kids grew up and moved out, we stopped nurturing our bond. He admitted that he'd channeled his energy into work and possessions. I admitted that I'd let resentment build up, never clearly telling him how unhappy I was. It was messy, painful, and occasionally it felt impossible. But we persisted. On the day that marked exactly 1 month since I forgot to cancel the auction, we had a counseling session that left me feeling particularly raw. We argued in front of the therapist, voices raised, as I recounted the final straw, our 5th forgotten anniversary. He tried to defend himself, claiming he lost track of time. I retorted that it was indicative of a deeper disregard. The therapist intervened, guiding us to find the vulnerability beneath our anger. Slowly, haltingly, we both shared our fears. He was afraid he'd failed us, that he was never going to be good enough for me. I was afraid that I'd wasted my life on someone who didn't value me. By the end of that session, we were both emotionally exhausted, but there was a fragile sense of authenticity between us, as though the walls were finally coming down. At home, we sat in the living room, silently letting the tension settle. Then he said, quietly, "I know I can't bring the car back. I'm not even sure if I want to." But can we try to start fresh? I studied him, searching for sincerity in his eyes. What does a fresh start look like for you? He hesitated, then said, maybe it's us spending time together, real time. Maybe it's me learning to show up for you, to remember the little things. And maybe it's you trusting that I mean it. I exhaled, the heaviness in my chest slightly easing. I'm not making any promises yet, I told him. But I'll try. He nodded, eyes filled with regret and cautious hope. In the following weeks, we made an effort to do small things together, cooking a meal side by side, going for a walk in the neighborhood, watching a show we both used to enjoy. It felt awkward at first, like we were retracing steps we'd long forgotten. But gradually, it became less forced. We found ourselves actually talking, laughing occasionally, discovering new layers to each other. I still felt the sting of what had happened, the unresolved sorrow. But for the first time in years, I glimpsed the possibility that we might reshape what we had into something honest, even if it bore the scars of what we'd gone through. One evening, as we were tidying up the kitchen, I asked him quietly, "What do you think about the next anniversary?" He looked at me, a flicker of apprehension in his eyes. Then he said, "I want to remember it. I need to. Because it matters." He swallowed, eyes glistening. "You matter." I'm sorry it took me so long to see that. My throat tightened. I gave a small nod, not trusting myself to speak. Maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to heal. The aftermath of letting his car be sold was messy and unpredictable. Some days, he'd still lash out with a bitter remark, or I'd snap at him for something trivial, because old habits die hard. But on other days, he'd surprise me with small gestures, folding laundry without being asked, leaving a note on the fridge that said, "Thinking of you." It was uneven, imperfect progress, but it was progress nonetheless. I realized that the sale of the car had forced us both to confront the reality of our crumbling marriage. It was like a catalyst that exposed every hidden crack, leaving us with a clear choice. Either we walk away from each other, or we try to mend what's broken. As painful as it had been, I found myself oddly grateful for that final push, even though it had come from a place of anger and hurt. There were still moments when I'd lie awake at night, replaying the day the car was towed away, the look on his face when he realized what was happening. I wondered if he'd ever truly forgive me, or if I would fully forgive him for the years of neglect. But at least we were finally talking, and that was more than I could say for all those silent years. Meanwhile, in my own heart, I felt a small flame of empowerment. I had stood up for myself, even if it was in a way I never intended. The me from a year ago wouldn't have dared to cross such a line, but maybe that was the problem. I never set boundaries, never demanded respect. This new version of me was still learning what it meant to insist on being valued. And he was learning, too, that I wasn't a given. One day, a letter arrived in the mail from the buyer. He had my address because of the sale paperwork. Inside was a photo of the car, freshly polished, sitting in front of a restored farmhouse. The buyer wrote a note saying how grateful he was to own it, how he cherished it every day, even took it out for Sunday drives with his wife, and how they'd come to appreciate their time together more because of it. I showed the letter to my husband, unsure of how he'd react. He studied the photo, face drawn. Then he let out a heavy sigh. "I'm glad someone is enjoying it," he said softly. I nodded, placing the photo on the table. "I guess it went to someone who truly appreciates it." Our gazes met. In that quiet moment, it felt like we both understood the symbolism behind it. Something precious taken for granted can slip away, and sometimes it goes to a person who sees its worth. We didn't speak that out loud, but we didn't need to. The dust of the aftermath continued to settle, slowly. We started to share more about our days again. He asked how my volunteering was going. I asked how his meetings were. We still argued, we still had nights of cold silence, but at least we were no longer ignoring the problem. Over time, we even revisited conversations about our kids, who had distanced themselves, sensing the tension. We discussed how to rebuild those relationships, to show them that we were trying to move forward in a healthier way. The memory of that forgotten anniversary still stung, along with the 4 before it. But as the next year rolled around, he made sure I wouldn't forget that he remembered. A week before our anniversary, he left a small note on my bedside table. I haven't forgotten. I'm planning something. For the first time in a long while, I felt a pang of tentative excitement. On the day itself, he brought me a bouquet of white lilies. I smiled, fighting back tears. We had a quiet dinner at home, just the two of us, reminiscing about our early years. He apologized again, sincerely, for all the times he'd neglected me, and I let him see how deeply it had wounded me. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Eventually, we found a semblance of stability. I wouldn't call it a fairy tale ending. There was too much water under the bridge for that. Yet, in a strange way, the destruction we went through gave birth to a new beginning. We started talking about going on a trip together, something we hadn't done in years. We both knew that trust isn't rebuilt overnight and there would always be a scar. But at least we were trying to hold each other's hand, rather than letting go. On one particularly reflective evening, I found myself staring at that framed photo of us and the car again. I felt a mixture of sadness for what was lost and gratitude for what was gained. If he hadn't forgotten our anniversary that fifth time, maybe I wouldn't have reached my breaking point. Maybe I wouldn't have let the auction go through. Maybe we would have continued to drift quietly, irreparably, until there was nothing left of us. It wasn't the path I would have chosen under normal circumstances. But in the end, maybe that drastic act was the only thing that saved us from total oblivion. Sometimes, love survives the fire because it's forced to burn away the dead weight of complacency. And for us, that dead weight was heavy indeed. I turned off the light and slipped into bed beside him, listening to his breathing. He stirred and reached for my hand in the dark, a gesture of comfort. I squeezed his hand back, not saying anything, letting the silence communicate our fragile truce. The memory of that moment at the auction's end, the final seconds ticking down, still lived in the back of my mind. So did the guilt, the heartbreak, and the empowerment. In a quiet reflection, I realized that for better or worse, we were still here, still together, stitching our lives back into a shape that might one day resemble love again. And maybe that was enough, at least for now. Because for the first time in a long time, neither of us was forgetting that this marriage was built by two people who needed to be seen, heard, and cherished. I closed my eyes, letting the past and the present merge, hoping that in the future, neither of us would forget the lesson we'd learned in such a painful, unforgettable way.